All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining. My name is Stephen Petticles, and I'm CEO of Clark Street Associates. Clark Street is a unique government consulting firm that works with commercial companies in the semiconductor industry to win very large federal grants that are focused on creating significant commercial growth for our clients. And the key difference between what Clark Street does and the more traditional lobbying firms of DC is that our team is both a group of former government insiders, but we're also a team of people that come from industry, from the semiconductor industry and others that have spent decades developing and commercializing the types of products that our clients are. And we've all leveraged partnerships with the federal government to help grow and expand those commercial companies over the years. So we as a group don't just understand the government side of things. We also have a unique understanding of commercial business and what it takes to win government grants that go beyond just the dollars that you win and instead focus on how those dollars can impact corporate growth and valuation. And that's allowed us to close billions of dollars in federal grants and contracts for our commercial semiconductor clients to grow their commercial businesses. We support companies all the way from Fortune 500 companies down to late stage innovative startups spanning from fab operators to OEMs and chip design and IP companies, all the way to advanced technology companies driving the bleeding edge of industry in manufacturing, AI, chip designs, and quantum computing. The idea for today's webinar about the global semiconductor companies and what you can expect post CHIPS 1.0 came up after our semiconductor team had sat through about the 10th webinar about what's going to happen with federal funding under the Trump administration and listening to the same plain vanilla descriptions about Trump's position on chips and other public policy around the semiconductor industry that we'd heard in the previous 9 events. And we were talking about how, functionally this is, how useless all this was, and because in terms of actionable material for the commercial semiconductor industry, and that if I were a semiconductor CEO, what I'd really want is a frank assessment of what all of this actually means for me and what I should be doing now in order to be ready for whatever opportunities are going to come out of these changes, rather than just listening to a bunch of platitudes and regurgitation of information from White House press releases. Because while there really, there's obviously a lot of unknowns out there right now about what's going to happen with chips and semiconductor funding, but there's also a lot of things that we do know today that can be really helpful for companies to position themselves. But understanding that really requires both a deep understanding of what's going on inside the government and also what's really important for commercial companies. And most importantly, how those things intersect. So to that end, we've gathered a fantastic panel of experts today that are smart, deeply knowledgeable about the US government and the semiconductor industry, and are also highly opinionated and willing to really dig into issues and talk about them, which is exactly what we want if you're trying to extract what's really going on, what it really means for the semiconductor industry, and what semiconductor companies really should be doing. We have with us today John McHugh from McHugh LeMay Associates. John is the former Secretary of the Army and a Republican congressman from the state of New York. Congressman Tom Davis from Holland and Knight, a former Republican congressman from the state of Virginia. Darren Crum from Purdue Applied Research Institute, the former director of microelectronics and packaging at Navy Crane, which is really the top federal organization interfacing between the Department of Defense and the commercial semiconductor industry. And John Hama, managing director for advanced microelectronics at Clark Street Associates, who's spent more than 30 years in the commercial semiconductor sector on the industry side of federal engagements. So let's start. We'll have each of the panelists give a brief introduction to themselves, and then we can get on to the discussion.
So I guess I'm lead off in this Rather impressive lineup. John McHugh here. Glad to meet all of you good folks, and a real pleasure to join with this webinar here this afternoon. I guess you could categorize me as one of the opinionated ones, which I suspect will come out a little bit during our discussion here today. As Tom noted, or I'm sorry, as Steve noted, I'm a former member of Congress, 9 terms in the House of Representatives, all of that time spent on the House Armed Services Committee. I eventually became the ranking Republican, senior Republican. On that committee, I also served on Intelligence Committee and the Foreign Affairs Committee. In 2009, went and was asked by President Obama to serve as Secretary of the Army, which I was honored to do for just over 6 years after leaving public sector life. Joined with my former Chief of Staff, Ann LeMay, and forming McHugh LeMay Associates. We're a very boutique organization focusing largely on Hill plays and Department of Defense, Department of Energy, etc. I think our main calling card is that if you hire us, you get us. The two of us are the principals. We pride ourselves in a very hands-on kind of approach to our representation, and we do plug and play with a great number of former Pentagon and Hill professionals as the needs of the client may dictate. So pleasure to be here today. Look forward to our discussion.
Thanks, John. Tom.
Thank you. I'm Tom Davis. I actually served with John. I was 7 terms in the House of Representatives. I was chairman of the Republican Campaign Committee 2 cycles, but more importantly, chairman of the Government Reform and Oversight Committee, where I did not just a number of investigations, but wrote a lot of law, worked with federal acquisition regulations, kind of an expert on procurement, and I was a procurement attorney, general counsel of a public company before I went into Congress. I'm now with Holland and Knight, which is a large law firm, one of the largest lobbying practices in the city, one of the largest law firms in the country, where we specialize basically in helping clients work their way through the maze on Capitol Hill and in the administration. We have several former members from both parties as partners in this firm, and I look forward to the discussion today.
Thanks, Tom. Aaron.
Good afternoon. So thanks to Clark Street for the invitation to participate today. I'm Darren Crum. I did 34 years in the federal government in DoD at NSWC Crane Division. Focused most of that time on microelectronics, doing a variety of different jobs across the microelectronics. I retired out last February. I'm now with the Purdue Applied Research Institute. We're a 501c3 nonprofit company, and our job is to take the tech out of the academia world and work with the defense industrial base to get that tech over into the defense system. So for the Purdue Applied Research Institute, we have the Microelectronics Lab, which I'm the director. We also have a Hypersonics Lab. We have an Infrastructure and Innovation Lab, and we have a new Energetics and Energy Lab. And across all those labs, the goal is to support national security and defense. And so we work closely with the Defense Industrial Base, as well as our partners like NSWC Crane Division and Air Force Research Lab, and other organizations within the DoD to bring all the good tech that is sitting in the portfolios of the universities and get it out and across and into the systems. Thanks, everybody.
Oh, sorry, and John Hamma.
Yeah, I guess, sorry about that. Yeah, so Steve gave obviously the preamble on Clark Street. I don't need to talk about, the company. My background is really in semiconductor industry. Now one of the veterans, I guess you could say, with about 35 years of time served in the semiconductor industry, across a variety of roles, both on the supply chain side, working with big capital equipment companies to help provide the necessary equipment technology to move the chip making process forward through successive technology nodes. And then really over the last 15 years, working more with fab organizations to drive disruptive, technology development in the areas of advanced packaging and sort of CMOS plus X, more than more. And, across that time, really engaging the federal government as a rich partner and early adopter in some of those advanced developments, leading to Clark Street, where I now kind of lead the practice for advanced semiconductor and derivative technologies for the firm.
All right. Thanks to everyone, and thanks all for joining. One last thing before we start, I'll be directing each of my questions to particular people at first, but I would encourage all of the panelists to weigh in with comments if you have anything else to add. Really, our goal here is to dig into these issues, so I always favor discussion over just monologue. So I'm sure you can all behave yourselves, and I'll jump in if not. So I'm going to start with a real softball question for Tom Davis, Congressman Davis. President Trump has taken a very strong position against the CHIPS Act, and there has been significant staffing cuts in the CHIPS Program Office. But at the same time, he's also made a big splash about TSMC's $100 billion investment, which was based in part on CHIPS funding. And Secretary of Commerce Lutnick has also come out publicly to state that CHIPS is, quote, an excellent down payment for ability to bring semiconductor manufacturing back to America. What are your thoughts on how to reconcile these positions, and what strategies should semiconductor companies be taking to maximize their opportunities within the government going forward?
Well, thank you for the question. First of all, I think it's important to note that the policy goals of CHIPS, onshoring American manufacturing, building up defense, are squarely in line with where the president wants to go, but he has an aversity to all things Biden. So what you're seeing right now is basically a rebranding of onshoring CHIPS manufacturing. They've got this investment accelerator initiative out of the Department of Commerce that is being widely heralded at this point. You've seen in their budgets that they're putting forward, everything else in government's being cut. They're adding hundreds of billions of dollars to defense spending, which means there'll be quite a pot of money, I think, going toward these initiatives over time. But because they've rebranded, there's a lot of confusion. Their idea here is that we can get better deals than we got before, but they're clearly looking at spending more money in these areas. And I think the one thing I would say to companies out there that are caught in between is to engage the administration. We have an old saying, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. That things that might have been in line before, it's important to be touching base. You look at with the current administration and the current decision makers. I'd also note that if you take a look at some of their drafts on what they want to do with the federal acquisition regulations, they're trying to open up the process to people and companies that have not been involved in government before, to get them into government. So I think there's tremendous opportunity, and I think there's a tremendous pot of gold at the end of this for companies that are wide awake and can navigate.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, Steve, I would add, I think, this is a good time, likewise, to be, engaging state governments in areas where companies may seek to do business, and look for business-minded states who can, bring their own sets of incentives to the table in partnership with the federal government. That was a key element of the CHIPS Act. And, I agree with Congressman Davis, about rebranding. But I don't expect that the importance of the state element will disappear either. In other words, in being kind of forward-leaning and engaging the administration, one of the other kind of old adages is when you bring your own, pot of money to the negotiating table, you tend to get closer to the outcome you want. So, having that strong engagement with the states at the same time can certainly pay dividends in those conversations at the federal level.
That's great. Thank you very much. The next question is for Secretary McHugh. in your mind, what does the opportunity landscape look like under the new Trump administration for other areas of untapped money for microelectronics and advanced technology development, funding outside of the CHIPS Act?
Yeah, I guess understandably, when you've got $39 billion appropriated for microelectronics activities in one bill, you kind of get very comfortable with that and like to see it continue forever, but that's just not the way government works. But I don't think this is a time for doom and gloom, and I'm kind of playing off what my former colleague Tom Davis said. There are a lot of opportunities that are going to occur, from this administration kind of looking very carefully at increasing, probably to a substantial amount, the Department of Defense budgets, which generally have provided somewhere around $10 billion a year from microelectronics kinds of activities. Expect that to continue at least at that level, if not even greater. They're thinking about what kind of deals can they cut. I think if there's anything in these uncertain times that we can say with a great deal of certainty about this particular president, he likes a deal. And it doesn't make any difference if he's dealing with the conflict in Ukraine or if he's dealing with tariffs. The company or the sector that can bring this administration a package of a deal that he can claim some credit for. That's what we recovering politicians like to do, take credit for things. I think there are some opportunities there. So, whether it's the regular appropriations process that is ongoing really 365 days a year, where influence can be brought to bear to meet funding requirements across emerging technologies, or those programs that have existed for a long time, it's time to kind of take more careful look. And as again, Tom Davis said, the key to success in that is engagement. As secretary, I sat there a lot of times when well-meaning individuals, well-meaning companies would show up, never heard of them before, with their hand out. Now, that's part of the business. I didn't take umbrage at it. But the fact of the matter is, the companies that succeed year after year are not the companies that just come and engage with the Department of Defense in times of need, but stay engaged with them so they better understand what the emerging needs and the technologies are going to be from a military perspective, and stay engaged so that the military is aware of what kinds of technological advantages they bring to the table. Might be advantages the company isn't even aware that they provide. So that, I think, is kind of a thumbnail formula for how you can succeed in the days and at least the next 3+ years ahead.
So I'll maybe throw in a point, which is even surprising to me when I hear it, is, I think you said DOD is spending $10 billion a year in microelectronics. There is a large fraction of that is going into to establishing new technology, establishing new manufacturing facilities. A lot of the things that the CHIPS Act was focused on. That is substantially more money than the CHIPS Act has spent over the last 4 years. So that's it really puts federal spending in perspective for me. Does anybody, I don't know if anybody else wants to comment on that, but I think CHIPS gets a lot of press and other funding avenues don't.
Yeah, I would add, Steve, that there are ways, for companies to engage in that funding, whether they be small businesses, or they be substantially working with small businesses, or they be classified as non-traditional defense contractors, where in many of those cases, cost share is actually not required. And there may be opportunity to get, the entirety of the work, or at least substantially funded, for outcomes that are, highly desirable to the Department of Defense.
Oh, that's a great point, especially when a lot of the CHIPS Act money was, 50% or less. In fact, in some cases, substantially less funded by the government. So in terms of the economic impact, it's a big difference. Sorry, Tom, Representative Davis, you were about to say something.
I was gonna just say, when you take a look at the overall budgetary situation, we've been spending more money for interest on the national debt than national defense. And the way the administration and Congress seem to be reacting to this is to extend the current basis, if you will, the tax cuts. They are ripping government to shreds at all other levels, including, it appears to be, Medicaid and some other areas, but they're adding money in these critical areas in defense. And I think that speaks to their priorities, that this is going to continue to be their priorities. There's a recognition this is still a very, very dangerous world, and we are getting beat on technology by China in some of these areas. So I think that emphasis is strong, despite his opposition to the CHIPS Act per se, because it was a Biden initiative. I think there are myriad ways that we're going to see more funding put into this than was even envisioned under the CHIPS Act.
I'd also like to add on the comment on the thread. So 10 billion, for DoD needs in microelectronics. I'd just like to emphasize that there's a difference between the CHIPS Act and what DoD spends their money on. Let's give everybody a little bit of credit here, and it was well coordinated. CHIPS Act was about onshoring, bringing the capability to manufacture onto U.S. soil. DoD has always been out to accelerate and build upon and mature the needs that they have, specific technologies. So two different areas of focus, a lot of money in each, but well aligned, I thought.
Great, thanks, Darren. I might, I'm gonna. Well, maybe pushback isn't quite the right term there, but I've certainly seen a lot of funding going in to support both construction of and expansion of physical operations in the U.S. funded through the Department of Defense, primarily because it is something they want to make sure is here because it's of interest to them, and sort of the same line of rationale. But can anybody comment on sort of the philosophy of the federal government? I think everybody's aware of technology development being a key focus, but in terms of onshoring or expanding or increasing capabilities, can anybody comment on that?
I'll make a quick.
Will someone?
Let me make a quick comment. Is that the defense bill, whether it's the appropriations of the NDAA, is in many cases really been a jobs bill. When you look at it, until you take a look at how these are procured, what the rules and regulations you need to follow to do this. So I think that's entirely consistent with where defense has always been. Is it's as much a jobs bill as a defense bill.
I would agree, Steve. I mean, yeah, the DoD has built facilities, but they were to address, let's say for the most part, they were to address specific needs. Whether it was a specific technology that commercial industry wasn't interested in or wasn't mature enough to take advantage of it, but the DoD did feel the need. And then there's all kinds of different programs that are established for that.
Yeah, I would add, Darren, that we've seen investments over the last couple of years about, companies being funded, whether it's through the Defense Production Act or through the DIPSEA consortium or through other means, to really plug critical gaps. Advanced packaging has been a focus in recent years, given the general lack of domestic production of printed circuit boards, build-up laminate substrates, wafering, and so forth, these kind of critical building blocks. I think, if anything, there's a heightened awareness now of what I'd call the entirety of the supply chain, from sort of the raw materials coming out of the ground all the way forward. And, a real interest in sort of reducing dependence on foreign supply chains, and particularly those obviously coming out of China, and an interest in all things reshoring for critical needs. And I think, you can see that reflected in kind of the recent reconciliation bill, guidance that's been put forth relative to resilience and, addressing some of those key supply chain gaps. So I think we'll continue to see that. And, companies who have an interest in standing up capability in the US, particularly as it relates to an area of, potential vulnerability. And that doesn't mean that there has to be zero of a kind presently existing. But when there is a significant shortage or there are key aspects of a supply chain, that are predominantly outside the US, there are certainly going to be opportunities for, good conversation and the potential for deal making to look for creative ways to bring that capability onshore.
So, John, you bring up a very interesting point here that I want to follow on, and I'll let anybody respond to this that wants to. Under the Biden administration, CHIPS, we saw a ton of money going out to help stand up enormous semiconductor fabs, leading edge, globally leading semiconductor fabs, but they were very large grants for very large operations. We didn't see nearly as much money going into the rest of the supply chain, the materials suppliers, the equipment suppliers, the entire ecosystem needed to support those big semiconductor fabs. And in fact, we saw CHIPS actually decline the application by Applied Materials, who is the world's largest supplier of semiconductor equipment. And so I'm curious what people think when you think about the supply chain. And John was talking about DoD in particular, wanting to make sure supply chain is secure, but we as a country, Trump, most of all, maybe are really pushing on supply chain assurance in the United States. What do people expect? I mean, let's say for the moment this CHIPS Act survives and the money continues to be available. How do you think about the rest of the supply chain, and how do you think the Trump administration will think about it? Will it be, more fabs? Will it be funding to smaller companies that build the supply chain? Something else?
Yeah, I mean, I can jump in maybe and add a thought and then hand off the microphone quickly. But with supply chain, it's easy to think about kind of the early pieces, right? The raw materials and things like that. And I think there's a sort of a big spotlight on that right now. Obviously, with prohibitions on things like gallium and germanium coming out of China, that really focuses the conversation fairly acutely. And I think with the equipment industry, and having spent a couple of decades in it, much like design, that's an element of the semiconductor industry that still has a substantial U.S. presence. Number of, the largest and market leading companies are U.S. based and have U.S. based manufacturing. And so it becomes sort of easy to overlook. I think it's important for those companies to be out in front of that and really educate about where the technology is going, how, upstart foreign competitors are exploiting, whether it be trade policy or otherwise, to rapidly grow their business, and the threat that poses over time. Because we're in a situation now where we have to reshore a bunch of things. We don't want to be in a situation tomorrow where we have to talk about reshoring the equipment sector of the industry. And so I think there's a real opportunity for equipment companies at all levels, to be engaging in that dialogue and really educating policymakers on what that next 10-year landscape, looks like, potentially with and without the help of the U.S. government.
Yeah, I think the broader supply chain. If you go back to the chips, I mean, when chips was originally put forward, it was not intended to be the end game, the end solution. It was meant to spur private investment. And so we know 39 million is not going to go far. So the idea was it would do the big heavy hitters and build those fabs. So I think the broader supply chain and the suppliers, the equipment manufacturers, they'll have to be looking at private investments. And John, you mentioned the states. They need to be partnering with the business-friendly states and looking at those opportunities, as well as DoD and DOE have their specific initiatives, like we mentioned in the conversation prior. So I think that the broader supply chain just needs to be looking and not relying on and looking at those ability to bring in the private investments. I think the administration will be looking for cases where that model doesn't work, and the private investment, for whatever reason, doesn't come through on those specific suppliers or equipment manufacturers. Maybe there's a case to be made to the new administration on why the investment is needed. So I think the government will be, I think the administration will be looking for also from a standpoint of they're trying to accelerate, as you, John, mentioned, the reconciliation bill that was all in the news over the weekend. The government's going to be looking to excel program capability. And so you start pulling those threads on nuclear deterrence and low-cost munitions and shipbuilding and everything. You start pulling that thread, it all filters down to when you want to accelerate and put more focus on it, it eventually comes down to microelectronics. So again, trying to be part of that solution for capability will help.
Great, thank you.
Let me also add, there may be access to potentially significant debt capital when you look at the DoD Office of Strategic Capital, or maybe even DOE LPO office. I think that gets overlooked sometime, but those are possibilities as well.
Actually, I'd love to. In fact, I have a question coming up about what some of those programs, how they could flow into this. So I'll hold that for just a second. I actually want to key off of something I think John Hammett just said, and which is critical minerals. I'm sure everybody has heard all the big hoo-ha about the president's initiatives and executive order on critical minerals, and the semiconductor industry is heavily driven by critical minerals. And so therefore, for pieces of the semiconductor industry that will be important, and that's where funding is going in. And one thing that's kind of interesting to me about that is critical minerals is an area that does fall squarely within DoD, but also DOE's purview. And all of this unspent money from things like CHIPS or the IIJA and the IRA bill that Trump also doesn't like, but is sitting there waiting to be spent, is money that can be applied to critical minerals. And therefore, as Congressman Davis just said, DOE actually has an intersection with semiconductor and semiconductor manufacturing, and even things like advanced chip designs that are associated with machine learning and other things, but drive down power consumption, fall squarely into that sort of funding area. So I guess I just made my own commentary. Nobody else to specifically comment on it, as I'm prone to do. Actually, so I will throw this out then, and I'd like to get people's thoughts on really what the role of and what can companies be doing now in order to engage with efficiently things like the Office of Strategic Capital, the proposed sovereign wealth fund, DOE's loan program. I mean, maybe I'm going to throw this, sorry to put you on the spot, Secretary McHugh, but thoughts on how these programs should play into what semiconductor companies are doing today, if anything?
Well, I think it goes back to my earlier comment about how companies need to be engaged at all times and really at all levels. And the offices and the programs that you mentioned, I think, are a pretty good example of where that can occur. Look, I think everybody that wants to do business with the DoD is intimidated as much as they are discouraged by the complexity of the acquisition process. And we could spend the rest of the afternoon just talking about that complexity. But the fact of the matter is the DoD has been working pretty hard to provide access points for companies who have certain technological advancements and technological capabilities, to make those capabilities and advancements known. The funding is something that can come out of those kinds of engagements, whether it's OSC or wherever where the funding can be procured. But I think if you don't ask in Washington, you won't get. And so I think the companies that tend to succeed, at least over the longer term, are the companies that actively engage with the DoD, in our case, or DOE, and make their technologies make themselves known. Otherwise, you're kind of lost in the shuffle, and it doesn't make it much difference how much funding opportunity is out there, how many sources of potential financing, credits, loans, whatever it may be, if you're not involved and aware of those considerations. So I'm not sure that answers your question, Steve, but.
Well, John, can I just follow through? I agree with you, but the one thing you need to understand about this administration, they're disruptors in a sense. The first thing they come into with their Doge groups and everything else is they take the top 10 consulting groups and they come up and they rip up their budgets. They've gone to each one of them saying, and they want new people in there. You take a look at who they're bringing in, looking at these different agencies, they are outsiders. They are looking at the procurement regulations, the federal acquisition regulations, looking at rewriting this that will allow other transactions and people who've traditionally been excluded from government contracting to come in and show us what you have. I think in theory, this is a great way to get people involved who've never been involved in government before. And I think the door has never been more open to people that have not been involved to come in. In many administrations, there were barriers to bringing in lobbyists and coming in and talking to people who were in the procurement cycle while anything was being contemplated. Right now, the door is wide open. This is, I think, an opportune time for companies to come in where the door is wide open and show what you can do, to talk about what the government needs and how you might fulfill that. And that's an interesting aspect of what he's brought to Washington. We'll see how it works out. But the early indications are that's the direction that they're going to continue to move.
I think there's another aspect, Tom, and I fully agree with you. It's sometimes the company is doing something in a technological field, whether it be microelectronics or otherwise, where they don't realize that they have something that would be of great use to DoD, either through an emerging program, an emerging platform, or an existing one. And so that takes me back to my comment about those who succeed over the long term are the ones who continuously engage. I agree with you. The opportunities there are probably more accessible than they've been in the last 50 years or more. But it's kind of a two-way street. You, as the company, tell DoD what it is you have available that you think is important to them, and DoD can give you guidance that here's what we need that maybe you can think about providing for our future needs. So it's a win-win situation, at least for the moment.
John, let me just take that one step further. I mean, traditionally, when you go to the Pentagon and other groups, you talk to federal employees, their mission is not to make a mistake. And so they've been not very innovative. And the way a lot of new ideas came into government is through the NDAA or members giving these people in the bureaucracy permission to take a chance and do something different. Right now, the door is wide open. It's almost like they've torn down the barn. They're trying to rebuild it. So for people with ideas, I think the entryway is wide.
Yeah, and I'd like to add a little bit to that, maybe on a specific area. Both my esteemed colleagues touched on the door being open, and certainly, Steve, you sort of started with using the Office of Strategic Capital as maybe an example. That's an office where they clearly have a "We're open for business" sign outside the door. And they're really looking to accelerate and scale private investment, with government as the partner in really supply chain technologies that are necessary for national security. It's easy to access their information online, and you can, in a 30-second Google search, find out that there are probably half a dozen different areas of priority that intersect microelectronics, be it quantum or trusted AI, future G wireless technology, broadly microelectronics. In their initial cohort, they've been lending up to $150 million and really for capital investment. But they have plans to expand that open into much larger investments, potentially in the order of 500 million or more, and a willingness to not only invest in, capital investment, but also working capital with what you would think of in a traditional lending world as pretty light hurdles, right? Meaning they're not so focused on things like IRR and leveraged and unleveraged returns and so forth. They're really looking to see, number one, can you pay back the taxpayer, and number two, can the business that we're funding get to cash flow positive in 3 years? And those are reasonably modest hurdles comparatively to how private equity or other sources of funding or traditional debt funding might look at the lendability, if you will. So I think also important, if you look in the kind of the text that's been put out in the reconciliation bill, there are multiple pathways where through which OSC is going to get increased funding, right? So this is clearly going to be a mechanism to transact dollars to industry. Highly recommend folks be putting that on a target list of organizations to go engage in the spirit of what Tom and John said earlier about come to DC and start talking to people.
John, let me just pick up on that again. I think appropriations, you could say, is a more fruitful and reliable path compared to the CHIPS Act. Less bureaucratic, getting that money directly, because there is a lot of money there. We can think that money will continue over the next 4 years, at least if you look at what's been presented to the defense committees in the reconciliation package.
Yeah, if there's one.
Tom, let me just pause 1 second. Tom, could you explain, you said you used the word appropriations process. Could you give 3 sentences on what that means?
Yeah, so to fund the agencies of government, there are 12 appropriation bills that come out every year from the different departments, and defense is half of the spending is in the defense bill. These are separate bills that are marked up through the Appropriations Committee and its Defense Subcommittee and go through the House and Senate and everything else. And those are separate bills. The president doesn't have a lot of discretion in spending money except what Congress appropriates. Some of that was pre-appropriated under the CHIPS Act, but the annual appropriation bill far exceeds that, be almost $1 trillion for the Defense Department. And in that pot, as that money is appropriated, if you can get that money through the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee and the Appropriations Committees, that's a reliable way to get money. And I would just say this: members, if you're in a Midwestern district, you can go to your member of Congress, you can talk to the Defense Department and try to get that through in legislation. It's an easier way sometimes than trying to go through all the red tape that you have under the CHIPS Act.
It's also
so just to clarify. Oh, go ahead, John, please.
No, I was just going to make the point. It's not only less red tape, it's also continuing. I mean, at least in theory and law, you're going to have an appropriations bill for the armed services each and every year. The funding recurs, which goes back to my earlier comment about $10 billion a year. You add that up over a decade, and as would be said in DC, now you're talking about real money. So the appropriations process is a more direct way. I think a lot of us spend a lot of time on Capitol Hill talking to individual members. It's a place where I think folks like us can be very comfortable in discussing what does DoD need, what kind of funding can we make available. And as a former authorizer, I feel a little constrained saying that, but I have to tip my hat to the appropriations folks.
Yeah. So just for anybody that isn't aware of that term, appropriations, basically the budgeting process for the federal government. So every year, Congress goes through appropriations, and that's the process of allocating money into each of the accounts needed to keep the country running. And so, as Congressman Davis and McHugh were saying, working with Congress, you can actually get money allocated for specific projects integrated into the budget, and that's something that can be done every year. So it's a reliable and far less controversial process than CHIPS. Yeah.
And Steve, just to add one point to that, the fiscal year for the government starts October 1. They never get the appropriation bills done on time. So that's why you continue to have continuing resolutions, sometimes government shutdowns when the House and Senate can't agree. But that's the appropriation process that runs the generation. It's only about 25, 26% of the budget because everything else is entitlement, wealth transfers, and interest. But it's a very, very important part. They tend to not come in October 1st. In fact, the last time, John, I think we passed all the appropriation bills on time was 1996. So they generally get delayed, but it still is what runs the government at the end of the day, sooner or later.
Yeah, sooner or later.
Reliable in principle.
Correct.
Go ahead, John.
The other thing I would just to add to what Tom said, and he's absolutely right. In the appropriations process, under the Constitution, revenue bills, all of that stuff has to start in the House. The president is kind of limited. I mean, he or she at some point in the future sends their budget up to Capitol Hill, but then the appropriators do their own business through the 12 bills that Tom mentioned. However, this current environment, I'd argue, is a little bit different in that I can't recall a president who has more influence with his majority party than this president does. And as I said earlier, he wrote a book, The Art of the Deal. This is a president who wants to make deals. And I think to ignore the administration totally and the possibility of taking a deal to him that he just finds so attractive is unwise at best. And I think you need to keep that in mind, that if you can come together as an industry, as a sector, microelectronics, for example, with some kind of deal, whether it's a big package on onshoring or whatever it happens to be, this president will become one of your biggest allies.
Yeah, I think that's actually is a very interesting thing. But this administration it is coordinated under Trump, and regardless of your politics, I think the ability to work with them to do deals is unparalleled, and as long as I've been doing this. So,
Dave, I just note the reconciliations are Republican play. That's a majority party play. Appropriations, though, you still need 60 votes in the Senate, which means there's a Democratic buy-in. So it is a little more. It's a different process than just going through the administration. And Democrats do have a say in that process.
Sure. Okay. Well, let's jump forward. I'm going to maybe put this next one to maybe to Darren. I don't think we've heard quite enough from you, although that's not true for great stuff. So, we've been talking about all of the other things that aren't the CHIPS Act, but the fact is the CHIPS Act is still in place. And I think CHIPS drove a lot of commercial semiconductor companies to realize the value of working with the federal government and the opportunity that's there. And I guess my question is, really have you go out on a limb, is CHIPS at the end of the road? Is that funding gone? Are we, do we have to move on, or is that going to continue in some other form, in some other way that people should still be thinking about?
So yeah, that's everybody's question, right? So what's going to happen? I mean, we talked earlier on. We talked earlier on about the rebranding, and so I think we'll see levels of that. But I think it will play out again. I think it's going to be looking towards that private investment as the mainstay. I think this was I view it. I talk about it as a kickstart to show that microelectronics is a path for private investment, and then also it's been mentioned. I think the things that drive advanced system capability within the DoD. I think you'll see investments there, continue to see investments in the DARPAs and the DIUs and the National Security Innovation and capital there. Yeah, I think it all comes down to for the continuation. I think it may be less visible as a entity, an investment part, microelectronics, and it will get wrapped up into the administration's focus on rapid acceleration for system capability and everything that we need on the system capability. So you see in that reconciliation bill, the shipbuilding and uh, all the nuclear deterrence, all that. I think you'll start seeing those capabilities flow in for the microelectronics as part of that. So they won't be so much in the forefront. They'll be part of how do you accomplish those aspects as you'll bring in new technologies, new microelectronics technologies, new architectures, new manufacturing processes and materials to accomplish that.
And Steve, I
That's
might add a
great.
comment to that. I think it's kind of important to recognize that there's still a huge amount of the CHIPS appropriated funds that have not been spent yet, nor have they been repealed, which would, take an act of Congress to do, right? So, and don't quote me on the number, but I think it's at least 8 billion or more that is, not yet obligated or spent. And so, the president put out an executive order on March 31st to establish the investment accelerator under the Department of Congress or Commerce, excuse me, with an appropriate executive that is not yet in place. Um, and, sort of a signal that their desire to do big deals there, right? Focus on kind of billion-dollar plus investments. I think that's in keeping with the desire of the president to make deals and not only big deals in the sense of dollars, but big deals in the sense of impact, relative to global competition with near, peer nations and so forth. So, if I was kind of an executive on the other side of the table still in a semiconductor company, I would be closely tracking that, looking to engage early as that office begins to get staffed out, be sharing ideas on how what I want to do aligns with the goals of the administration and could be a suitable use for some of those funds. So this is an important time for Washington to be hearing from industry about, as yet uh, unfilled, if you will, priorities, right? Particularly with that have overlay with national security and or economic, benefits that would accrue to the nation. So, from my perspective, those funds haven't gone away, and certainly, I think Secretary Lutnick kind of was quoted as saying it's a good start. Does that mean there's going to be a CHIPS 2.0? I don't think any of us know that yet. But certainly with some of these, recurring investments like the Office of Strategic Capital, like the potential for a sovereign wealth fund, you can see, some signaling from the administration that they're going to want to continue, to engage industry and continue to strengthen domestic manufacturing, domestic supply chain resilience, and so forth. And so to the extent that you have a story that reads on those priorities, it's a really great time to be talking to senior, policymakers about it.
One thing I'm absolutely certain
Great.
of, if there is a CHIPS 2.0, it won't be called CHIPS 2.0.
Yeah. Okay, I want to change the topic slightly and maybe throw one more to Darren. I think most of what we've talked about has been about chips manufacturing, in terms of capabilities. How do you think advanced chip architectures like those for, optimized for AI or for quantum computing or whatever, how is that going to play into President Trump's funding strategy? It's clearly an area where he states that we will and is putting a lot behind maintaining global dominance. Is there going to be new funding in that area? How do you see that coming together over the coming years?
Oh, I definitely see there's going to be activity there. I view it as an arms race, specific to AI and quantum. I think if you think about the applications drive AI and quantum, so it kind of ties into the administration about having an end state. So definitely not AI and quantum just for the sake of it is driving those applications. Those applications will drive new architectures, and the new architectures will drive new materials and new fabrication processes and new equipment. So I think you're going to see stuff, so continued effort, NSF, DOE, DOD, there's the quantum initiative that got stood up a few years ago. So I think you're going to still see a lot of funding going into those. I think the difference, maybe the focus will be, is that tie to the applications. It's not just about AI and quantum for the sake of AI and quantum. They're all great buzzwords and are bringing a lot of capability. But I think it has to be tied to the application and how they fit into the solution space. And I think that will help drive down to the microelectronics piece. So I think for the people who want to play in that space in AI and quantum, I think you have to really make that connection to tying to the system level solution. And so specifically for example, for DoD, we want AI at the edge. So what does that mean at the sensor edge, on our jets, on our hypersonic bodies, whatever it is, we want AI there. And so I think you have to tie the microelectronics to that end application instead of just touting, I do AI, I make an AI chiplet, an AI accelerator. You're going to have to tie it to the, what is that performance that you're bringing to the system level. So tie it to the solution. And then I think another key point is for everybody to remember is that dual use capability. So not just the DoD, but if you can make the DoD wants you to satisfy the DoD needs, but they really want to see you have a commercial application for it as well, because that means it's more likely to be sustainable. So remember that. And then I like the theme that kept coming up here in the last 10, 15 minutes is coming as an industry collective. And if you can come together with the complete team that can go solve a problem, and that's at the administration's forefront, and you can solve it with the microelectronics, and you can show how all that plays out as a collective, I think that is very valuable.
Let me maybe dig in on one thing you said there, because you mentioned DoD. They want AI and they want it for jets or something like that. And I would venture to guess that there are no companies on the phone that want to particularly spend their time figuring out how to get AI that works really well in jets. But then you brought up what I think is a really important point, this drive for dual use technologies. I mean, the government has recognized that if they try to do stuff that's just good for a jet, they're going to be a decade behind where the industry is, because that's just not you just can't keep up. And so what's really important there is understanding what those applications are, understanding what the needs are, and being able to map the things that you're developing commercially and the capabilities that you're developing commercially, map those over to show why they're valuable for those applications. It's not about developing something that's a solution for that application. That's for whoever it is that builds the jet. And so that's one of the things where I think a lot of companies shy away because they think, that's not something we want to be involved in. That doesn't mean the government and DoD, for example, won't be willing to put a lot of money into helping you develop that thing you want to commercially for exactly that reason. So thanks for bringing that up. One other thing, and I'll put this out to the panelists, but you mentioned, Darren, the various advanced architectures and related to AI, and then you threw in DOE into that mix. And again, this really interests me because I'm always interested in where there are other big pots of money that people can go after that aren't necessarily the obvious ones. And DOE, obviously, they run all of the major supercomputing facilities, and they care about chip architectures because AI and quantum are a big part of what they're doing. But if you look, now forgetting who published this, although can probably somebody can dig it up while we're sitting here, but it was recently a study that showed that based on data center growth in the U.S., that by 2027, 40% of the data centers in the country will not have access to sufficient power. And that's a comment on, the need for us to build out better power infrastructure, production, and transmission, but it's just as much a commentary on the need for developing more advanced chips, more energy efficient chips, more energy efficient designs for data centers, things that just reduce the power requirement. And for chip design, both just manufacturing capabilities that produce more efficient chips, or designs that produce more purpose-built chips like for AI. That makes those core technologies become DOE-centric. It become the kind of thing that, for example, you could spend the billions and billions of dollars that were appropriated for the bipartisan infrastructure law and IRA, which the administration doesn't care about the fact that that's money for clean, but they sure do care about the fact that that's money that could be spent on advancing semiconductor technology to allow them to build more AI data centers. And so those are things where there are really unexpected sources of money that for different companies may be available. And again, that's about understanding what are the needs of the government and how can you map what you want to do onto things that you can convince them that they should want you to do with their money.
Yeah, I think, Steve, that's a good point. It was actually Gartner who put that, study out for industry. And, it's not coincidental that if you look at Secretary Wright, the Secretary of Energy's kind of top 9 priorities, at the top is power dominance, right? But on that list is AI and quantum. Similarly, there was a recent kind of order put out to make the 17, I think it is, DOE National Lab campuses available to support co-located AI data center infrastructure and projects for, what I'd call high density power delivery, whether that be small scale nuclear or otherwise. And that's a recognition of the reality that, to enable kind of widespread AI use and the amount of AI infrastructure that's going to be required to do that, the strain on the grid is going to be tremendous, right? And so I think, there's a real opportunity for specifically new kinds of architectures that can dramatically reduce the consumption side of the power equation. Whether that be using things like photonics to reduce the waste heat generation in the interconnect, or more efficient, chip designs that are sort of from the ground up built for AI workloads. There is going to be, I think, a real opportunity to come forward and engage sort of whole of government, if you will, between, as Darren pointed out, kind of NSF as well as DOE, DOD, because AI certainly has national security implications. It's what I like to refer to as kind of our generation's, space race, right? In the same way that the US led the development of nuclear weapons, and then, led the kind of drive to the moon, winning the AI race is kind of no less important, and, expects to accrue kind of socioeconomic benefits for decades to come to those who get there first and are able to really establish the frameworks and sort of the world order for the technology. So you cannot lead in AI if you don't build world-leading AI hardware, domestically. It has to be a priority, and it's a priority across multiple departments, really what I'd call whole of government. So folks who have a good story there relative to sort of the melding of the technological aspect of AI leadership from a performance perspective and the energy aspect from the standpoint of efficiency, those are stories that I think the administration is going to be very interested to hear.
Great, thank you. I'm going to give one last question and then maybe jump over to some of the audience questions. This one, I'm going to send it to Tom Davis, and I'm a little afraid to ask this one because it could easily devolve into talking about tariffs for the remainder of our time. But a lot of people are obviously looking and wondering how long it'll take for the tit-for-tat global trade wars to play out. Do you have a perspective on that, and as well as what you think companies can be doing now to minimize any negative impact of tariffs, within anything else within the government?
Well, we have seen when industry leaders come together and can talk to the president that he'll make a revision to his policies. We're seeing that with an announcement in Michigan today on auto tariffs. We've seen this in announcing one thing one day and pulling back a couple of days later or delaying something. So I think this is still a work in progress. The other thing I would note is these tariffs are all being done under an emergency provision, which means they don't have the permanence to them that would ordinarily attract the kind of investment you'd get if they were put into law with congressional enactment. So I think it's a work in progress. And what I have found with in companies that have come to us that have had issues is you meet with the trade negotiators, and we've been able in some cases to make them changes, hold back, have second thoughts. But this is going to be a work in progress, I think, as this bounces around. And politics weighs in as well. I'll just add this as a former Republican campaign committee chairman. I'm going to say this, that the president's numbers right now, he's 20 points underwater, as we say, 38 favorable, 58 unfavorable. Tariffs are a big part of that. And I think that's going to shape him as he moves forward in terms of how aggressive he's going to be and at what point he declares victory and moves on to something else.
Any other last comments on that?
Yeah, I guess I would add just one, and I've said it before, that I think a good defensive play, is to be engaging states, particularly states that are business minded or that are seeking to, maybe stand up semiconductor clusters. So particularly if you're, supply chain company and maybe you're kind of international and you're looking for U.S. exposure as a way to mitigate the risks and uncertainty of trade policy. Now is a good time to be really engaging state governments in how states can put interesting packages together to help facilitate, that investment. And that could take the form of, some actual grant dollars, but is probably more likely to take the form of lenient tax policy, perhaps, credits for workforce and job creation, abatements for future taxes and so forth, which collectively and perhaps coupled with some interesting, debt financing opportunities that the government is putting forth through vehicles like OFC and perhaps LPO, could make for a compelling business case to think about onshoring some capability.
Yeah, that's a good point, and I'll throw one last one in, which is, we have a division of Clark Street that does manufacturing site selection and an incentive negotiation with states. And one thing we've seen with the uncertainty around all these big grant programs is that states are stepping in. They don't want to lose those jobs that were coming based on federal funding, and so are stepping in and being more aggressive about figuring out how they might be able to fill the gap during this period of uncertainty to make sure that companies continue to move forward anyway. So not a bad time to be talking with states about that, and there's quite a lot of flexibility that some of them have for creating incentives. So I'm gonna let's switch over to talk about some of the questions provided by the audience, and I'll encourage all the panelists to jump in. Not like I could stop you, but and I'd like to thank everybody who submitted questions before the session, as well as the lot of questions that have come in during the session through the chat. If we can't get to all of them, we'll follow up in email. One question, I mean, this is a good one, and maybe I should have asked it, but for companies that were awarded CHIPS funding, is that funding now at risk based on the new administration?
Well, let me just say that of the 34 CHIPS awards that were announced, 20 are finalized. The others, I think, are still up in the air. And what we've said all along is engage with the administration. There are clawbacks in some areas. And I think engaging with the administration is the most important thing you can do.
Yeah, to add to that some of the tools you have at your disposal to do that don't, two of them are on this panel with me, right? You've got congressional members who want to see that economic development in their districts. They want to see that job creation. It's important, that they're hearing from companies who may be stalled or tied up in negotiation, that those projects are currently not moving forward, and that the promise of the job creation, the investment, the economic benefit of that investment is likewise stalled. Particularly when those projects, and I hate to play politics, but particularly when those projects are in red districts, there's an additional voice there with the administration to let them know that the core base of voters who put President Trump in office are being affected by the lack of progress on contracting. So I would not hesitate to be reaching out to your elected, representatives and educating them on the status of the project and what's needed to move it forward, and seeking their help in that regard.
Yeah, that's critical right now, and companies that are thinking in critical ways, I hope, are doing exactly that, John. It's great advice. Nothing gets a member of Congress's attention like loss or gain of jobs. And the administration, again, as you said, especially in red districts, may not want to hear about it, but really do need to hear about it. The other thing, I think this is going to be a case-by-case basis. And in that, I mean, your award may or may not be in jeopardy depending upon what your award was for. I think those that are involved in leading edge AI are probably going to be more established and more likely to make it through to the finish line than those who were less involved in areas where the critical technology, where the supply chain is not as in jeopardy as it is for some. But we're going to have to wait and see how it plays out. It'll be an interesting process. But as I said earlier, in Washington, if you don't ask, you don't get. Well, here, it's a matter of not sitting back and keeping your head down and whistling past the proverbial graveyard. This is a time you need to be, I would argue, aggressive, not just with your members of Congress, but also engaging. Let's say you've got a DoD-dependent technology, engaging a DoD to let them know you need the help in sustaining this program.
John, let me just.
Yeah, sorry, give me one second, Tom, and then I'll turn it over to you. One thing that I think is important for everybody to understand, because you said something important, John, which was, if you're a leading edge AI, then maybe you're safe, but other things you might not be. The reality is every company in the semiconductor supply chain in some way impacts stuff like AI. There are certain areas that the Trump administration is really behind, others that aren't. Don't leave it to the people coming into these program offices to be able to figure out whether you are or are not critical to those areas. Going in there, they don't necessarily have the time to think about it, as thoroughly as you do, for sure, and they don't necessarily have the experience doing it. So you going in, meeting with them, helping them understand why what you're doing is critical to those things that are important to the Trump administration is the way to protect yourself. Because the other things are things they're going to look at and go, well, I don't get why that's important, so it's not important. My job is to find a way to get rid of as many things, and this is one I don't understand. So don't let that happen. And that is, again, and engage early before they start making those determinations. Sorry, Tom, please continue.
No, I agree with you. And to complement that, I would say you have to read the room. When you go in, you need to know who you're talking to. What are the points that they're going to respond to? I've seen people walk in and they engage the government, but they engage them the wrong way. They don't understand what the person at the other end of the table is looking for. They look at it as some sort of entitlement. We've won this. We had a grant. We didn't get it. You need a translator to make this stuff work because you get one shot at them. And I've seen clients walk out of the room that haven't helped themselves. They've hurt themselves because they didn't have the right preparation and guidance walking in to know how to get what they wanted.
Okay, so we've spent a lot of time on that one question. Let's try to get to some others. So what's happening with the NSTC program funded under the CHIPS Act? That's the National Semiconductor Technology Program. And should we be getting involved with that program today? John, that might be a good one for you, John.
I'm happy to add some thoughts on that. So first of all, I'll happily say I don't know any more than most people do about what's actually happening with NSTC. What I do know is that when times are uncertain, really, I would say maintaining optionality is kind of your best friend, right? In other words, if you've been engaged, I would stay engaged. If you haven't been engaged, I would look for ways to engage, for the simple reason that, the government is not expert in all things. In fact, they're not expert in many things. And often in these areas, they really look for thought leaders to help guide strategy and policy. And really, the intent of NSTC is to establish at a national level sort of that thought leadership of what the key technology roadmap should be. Right. And I think for the savvy companies who are either looking to stay engaged or get engaged, an interesting way to think about that is to say, how can I frame this message perhaps a little bit differently that brings it in line in parallel path with the kind of the goals, if you will, and the key priorities of the administration. And they're not shy about telling you what those things are. Right. So to the extent that, and we've seen companies that have been funded by DOE doing exactly this and defocusing perhaps, for example, on the greenness of their technology and focusing instead on how it drives American innovation and domestic manufacturing and onshoring of supply chains. Those are all great messages. You don't have to dilute the technology message. But understanding, I think, as Tom Davis just said, reading the room, like what's important to the audience, they're going to need to hear from somebody, right? The federal government is not chock-a-block full of semiconductor experts. So I would be looking for those avenues to remain engaged and really get your voice heard. And so in the absence of any definitive data one way or the other, I would absolutely look to stay engaged with NSTC, with the National, Advanced Packaging Program, with the manufacturing institutes, and continue to try to shape the narrative in a way that's advantageous to your company and what you're trying to do.
Great. So I'm going to combine two questions here. What has the impact been, or what will it be, from all the staffing cuts that happened within the CHIPS office? How's that going to affect current awards and future awards? And have there been other major job cuts within the government that would impact some of these other funding avenues that we've talked about, Department of Defense or strategic capital or things like that?
Well, I'll just take a quick stab. I mean, the fact is everything is affected. They gave buyouts to just about every agency in government, and people took, who were close to retirement, many of them took the buyouts and are going somewhere else. And then there have been some kind of across the board cuts in some other areas with people out. So right now, until this thing settles itself, the government is not running on all four cylinders. There are people that aren't there, that aren't able to fulfill this out. And I haven't looked at the CHIPS office to see what's there and who's been cut. But I can take a look at some of these other agencies that the Democrats loved, and I think the Republicans have basically emptied those offices to the extent that they could. They can't do away with agencies in some cases, but they can defund them and they can move them around, and we've seen a lot of that. So across government, we're seeing a diminution in their ability to respond quickly as they go through this. Look, remember, they've got to lose a lot of money very quickly. They got to lose weight very fast because we're in a spending spiral at this point where our debt to GDP ratio is one of the 10 worst in the world. And that's got to be, they've got to resolve that some way, and government cuts is going to be one of them. So this is a tough time for the next few months till this gets sorted out.
I think if someone for the Trump administration were here, and you can have a discussion or an argument even whether or not this comment would be accurate, but they would tell you the vast majority of the people they cut in the CHIPS program were doing absolutely ridiculous things. And they'd point to the social justice provisions, the DEI provisions that you got to give in your programs. You got to have daycare centers, that kind of thing, that they deem, rightly or wrongly, to be absolutely superfluous to the objectives of the program. So I think that may have some accuracy, some veracity to it. But to Tom's point, you remove that many people from any kind of system, let's in this case, it's the federal government system, that's going to take a lot of readjustment to get back into a flow that resembles even remotely business as usual. So it's going to be disruptive. I think CHIPS would be the Trump pushback as to what those folks were doing was not worth having them on board.
Yeah, I would agree.
So let me put a pause. Sorry, we're coming up on time, and I would say one last thing on that, which is it's going to take a while for that to happen. The reality is, people starting to engage with the government for the first time, it takes a little while to spin up. And as you say, someone said, I think John McHugh said, you don't want the first time you talk with a congressional member or someone in authority to meet you to be you holding your hand out. So it's not bad that there is going to be a little bit of time to figure out how to position new projects. We're almost up on time. I wanted to just give each of the panelists a moment to make one last comment before we wrap up. Why don't I start with Congressman Davis? Oh, you're on mute.
Again, not just look at the CHIPS Act, but appropriations, I think, continues to be a very fruitful and reliable path to just applying to the CHIPS Act at this point. And if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. So you need to be engaged. If you have a potential, if you have something pending, I think that engagement is potential, and I think you need a Sherpa to walk you through there to make sure you're saying the right things to the right people, to make sure that the priorities, your priorities are congruent with those of the administration.
Great. Aaron.
I think everybody needs to think about tying to this solution. And so we've seen from the administration that military capability for DoD, military capability, and getting systems deployed, advanced systems, upgrading our systems, a lot of system focus. So I think while you're in microelectronics and there'll be pots of money for microelectronics, I think there may be more of a criteria in the selection process of, okay, it's great, it's microelectronics, but how does it tie to the system level? And that requires the microelectronics people to be well-versed in how they can solve the system problems. They don't have to know how to integrate it and operate the system, but they need to have that on their team, that capability, those mission partners who understand those requirements. I think it's going to be key.
Great, thanks. John McHugh.
Yeah, it's kind of what I opened my comments about an hour and a half ago when I said, the CHIPS has been a wonderful influx of substantial dollars, but there are a lot more opportunities out there that occur on a regular basis that everybody ought to take a look at because they're, particularly in the aggregate, very, very substantial. I would also suggest, as I think I indicated previously as well, don't assume that DoD knows everything or that the federal government knows everything. They oftentimes need to hear from industry leaders and people who have disruptive and emerging technologies what those capabilities are that they may have, they being DoD or the federal government, have absolutely no idea are available and could be very, very important to their programs. So that takes you back to what I think all of us have mentioned in one way or another, at one time or another here today, into engagement and trying to be forward leaning, both with Congress and with the applicable departments, DoD, DOE, et cetera, so that they know who you are and they're not afraid to come to you with questions that can lead to opportunities.
Fantastic. Thank you. John Hanley, you got 1 minute. Oh, less than 1 minute.
Yeah, I'll just quickly kind of pull the thread that Tom Davis mentioned about the Sherpa. I think engaging government's not for the faint of heart. There are very few paths from A to B in government that look like a straight line. It's a complex environment. It takes a complex engagement model that sort of blends business development and technology and relationships, and the ability to make your technology relatable to people who think about it differently. To Darren's point about systems, people who are thinking about outcomes, not about widgets or components of widgets. And so whether regardless of where you get help, I would encourage folks to look for the right help, to help get that message out in a way that is constructive, that captures the attention of the audience, because there is a tremendous amount of potential benefit in engaging government, despite the fact that it is, complex and perhaps daunting to the uninitiated. So.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you all, both participants and attendees, for spending an hour and a half talking about this. I think it's important. I think it's interesting, and I think a lot of people, as I said, it feels like there's a lot of chaos and uncertainty, and there is. But there's also a lot that people know and a lot that's actually happening. DC is a lot bigger than just the president, and people forget that. And so a lot of things happen in parallel with the stuff that you see now happening. So with that, we'll wrap up. Thank you to everybody, and I think there's a slide on the screen here. I imagine we'll leave it up for a little bit after everybody drops off, with contact information for all the attendees. Everything in this webinar will be available. A recording will be available online, as well as this contact information. So everybody have a great rest of your day.